single forgotten scroll can unravel centuries of carefully preserved history. In the silent ruins of Ost-in-Edhil, a High Elf Loremaster named Elaran made such a discovery. The crumbling parchment spoke of a shadow weaving, a hidden force of corruption that worked to collapse great kingdoms long before their recorded downfalls. By the end of this journey, you will understand the subtle patterns of power that can topple empires from within. Elaran knew his pursuit of this forbidden knowledge defied his cautious superiors. He risked everything, his reputation and his very safety, to follow a thread that threatened to shatter the foundation of elven memory itself. What secret was so dangerous it had to be erased from history, and what shadowy architects patiently wove the downfall of kings? I am curious to know, where are you listening from right now, and what is the local time where you are? Do you believe the greatest threats to a kingdom are the armies at its gates, or the whispers in its halls? A cold sea spray stung Elaran's face as the smuggler's vessel cut through the fog. His journey had led him from the elven libraries to the ragged, human-controlled ports that were once proud colonies of Númenor. He was not searching for gold or glory, but for a whisper of a relic, the Stone of Seeing. Legends claimed it did not show the future, but held echoes of the past, like a deep well of memory. To find it, the Loremaster had to descend from his ivory tower into the grimy reality of the mortal world. This meant dealing with men whose loyalty was measured in silver. Elaran found a dockmaster, a man with greedy eyes and a network of informants, and paid him a heavy purse for information and passage on a ship that asked no questions. The transaction felt unclean, a necessary corruption that left a bitter taste, but he believed the end justified the means. He could not have known that in that shadowy port, every coin had two faces, and every whisper was heard by more than one set of ears. His generous bribe was a beacon in the dark, drawing the attention of those who move like smoke. That very night, as Elaran prepared to depart, he sensed he was being followed. Figures detached themselves from the deeper shadows between the warehouses, their movements silent and synchronized. There was no demand for his money, no common robbery. They moved with a purpose that was far more terrifying. He was their objective. Forced to abandon his planned departure, Elaran fled into the maze of alleys, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He escaped with his life, but with nothing else. The encounter left him shaken and profoundly aware. He was not the only one hunting for these artifacts. The question now burned in his mind, colder than the sea wind. Who were these pursuers, and what did they want with the echoes of a fallen kingdom? The salt-stained fugitive found no refuge in the white city of Númenor. Elaran stood in the court of King Eärendil, the very air smelling of polished stone and quiet power, a stark contrast to the filthy port he had fled. He laid out his fragmented evidence before the throne, the damaged scroll and his own desperate testimony speaking of a shadow that consumed Númenor from within. He spoke of spies, of a patient corruption that twisted loyalties and sowed discord long before the first wave crashed against the shore. The king listened, his brow furrowed in thought, but his court was a different matter. Murmurs rippled through the hall. A lord with a jeweled dagger scoffed openly, calling it elven fancy, a bedtime story to frighten children. Another, a steward who managed the royal accounts, suggested the Loremaster was merely seeking patronage for a fruitless, and perhaps treasonous, obsession. Their jealousy was a subtle poison. They saw a foreign scholar capturing the king's ear with wild tales, and they moved to protect their own influence. Elaran's truth was dismissed not because it was unbelievable, but because it was inconvenient. Realizing his public appeal had failed, the Loremaster turned to the shadows of the city itself. He used the last of his coin to discreetly inquire after a man named Baranar, a historian who had once served the court until his own theories about the kingdom's fragile alliances saw him cast out. He found Baranar not in a library, but in a dimly lit tavern, his eyes holding the weary knowledge of a man who has seen his warnings ignored. Their meeting was brief and hushed. Baranar said little, but as they parted, he pressed a small, tightly folded piece of parchment into Elaran's hand. Back in the solitude of his borrowed chamber, Elaran unfolded it. The message was not written in ink, but scratched faintly into the paper with a pen. It contained no grand revelation, only a single, chilling sentence. Beware the eyes in the king's own council. The pursuit was no longer just about ancient history. The architects of shadow were not a relic of a drowned kingdom. They were here, in the heart of Arnor, whispering into the ears of power. Elaran's quest for knowledge had just become a conspiracy. He was now trapped inside. The coded message was a key that fit only one lock, the broken tower of Amansul. Elaran climbed the windswept hill under a bruised twilight sky, the ancient stones of the watchtower standing like broken teeth against the horizon. It was a place of forgotten glory, a sentinel that had witnessed the birth and slow decay of Arnor. He moved carefully through the rubble-strewn courtyard, the silence feeling heavy and deliberate. It was in the main hall, where a great circular chamber lay open to the elements, that he found the trap. A shadow shifted, then another, and suddenly the ruins were alive with grim-faced Dunlending tribesmen. They did not move like opportunistic scavengers. They emerged with a disciplined silence, their crude weapons held with a purpose that spoke of specific orders. They were not there to rob a lone traveler. They were there for him. The fight was a frantic, desperate dance across crumbling flagstones. Elaran was a scholar, not a warrior, and he was driven back by their relentless advance. His only advantage was the tower itself, its age-weakened structure betraying them all. As he dodged a sweeping axe blow, his shoulder slammed against a cracked pillar. The stone groaned, then gave way in a cascade of mortar and rock. The collapse was sudden and thunderous, creating a cloud of choking dust and a jagged new opening in the floor. Without a second thought, Elaran threw himself through the gap, falling into the darkness below as the Dunlendings were buried or scattered by the falling masonry. He landed hard in a subterranean storage room, his body aching but intact. Lying there in the dust and silence, the truth settled upon him with a colder weight than any stone. These men had been waiting. They knew his route, his destination. This was not a chance encounter with hill brigands. They were directed, their ambush set by someone who had read Baranar's secret message as clearly as he had. He was not just a researcher following a historical thread. He was prey, and the hunter knew every step he was going to take before he took it. The cold seeped from the stone floor into his bones, a dull echo of the pain from his bruised ribs. Elaran huddled in the dark, listening for any sound of his pursuers above. He heard only the wind whistling through the broken tower, a lonely sound that offered no comfort. Then a new shadow fell across him, not the shifting dark of the ruins, but the solid, silent form of a man. He wore the worn leathers and travel-stained cloak of a ranger, his face grim and his eyes holding the weary vigilance of the wild. This was Caelen, a descendant of the Dúnedain, who watched the fading borders of Arnor. His hand rested on the hilt of his long knife, and his gaze was one of deep suspicion. He had little love for elves, seeing them as aloof and meddlesome, but the old alliances, the bonds forged in the war against the shadow, still held some weight. He saw not an elf, but a wounded creature caught in a trap, and the code of his people demanded action. He did not offer a hand, only a low, commanding whisper. "You cannot stay here. They are sweeping the lower levels." Caelen's decision to offer shelter was a quiet war fought behind his own eyes. He led Elaran not to a safe village, but to a hidden hunter's den nestled in the thick roots of a gnarled oak, a place known only to his kind. He shared his water and a strip of dried meat, his silence a wall between them. That wall was shattered by the distant, sharp call of a horn. It was not a Dunlending war cry, but a clear, military signal from the south. Trackers, sent from Númenor itself. Caelen's head snapped up, his earlier suspicion hardening into a cold, certain truth. The king's own men were hunting the elf he had just saved. His oath to protect the innocent and his distrust of Elaran's purpose collided in that moment. To turn the Loremaster over would be to honor the crown's command. To protect him was to become a fugitive from the very kingdom he was sworn to guard. There was no more time for debate. The horn sounded again, closer now. Caelen made his choice. He grabbed his pack and thrust a spare cloak at Elaran. "We move now." Their flight into the wilds was a brutal test. Elaran, a scholar of quiet halls, struggled to match the ranger's punishing pace through thicket and stream. Caelen, for his part, had to constantly adjust his stride, his instincts for evasion and concealment challenged by his charge's inexperience. They spoke little, their partnership forged not in words, but in shared action. When Elaran's strength faltered on a steep incline, it was Caelen's strong grip that hauled him up. When Caelen paused, listening to a sound only he could detect, it was Elaran's silence that proved his worth. The peril they shared became a common language, a fragile thread of trust spun from the necessity of survival. The hunter and the scholar, two strangers bound by a shadow that threatened them both, vanished into the deepening woods, leaving the king's trackers to search in vain. What common ground could possibly exist between an elf who sought forgotten truths and a man who lived only in the harsh present? Their survival would depend on finding it. The only light in the refuge came from a single tallow candle, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows across walls of packed earth. Caelen unrolled a brittle piece of vellum across a rough-hewn table, its corners held down by stones. "These are not maps for hunting," he said, his voice low. "They are star charts, passed down through my line." To Elaran's eyes, they were a beautiful mystery, tracing the paths of celestial bodies. But Caelen's callous finger traced not stars, but lines connecting the great kingdoms of old, with annotations in a forgotten dialect scrawled in the margins. He translated the term the scribes used for the force that bent these lines. The architects, they did not raise armies, he explained. They redirected the flow of things. A trade route would mysteriously fail. A fertile land would suddenly see its harvests blighted, and a steadfast alliance would fracture over a single, bitter misunderstanding. These charts recorded the symptoms of a sickness, a pattern of deliberate collapse. Elaran's mind raced, the pieces of his own research clicking into this terrifying new framework. With a trembling hand, he retrieved his own damaged scroll from its protective case, laying it beside the star chart. The High Elven script spoke of shadow weavers and their subtle arts. He cross-referenced the dates of political upheavals in honor with the periods of trade disruption noted on the Dúnedain chart. The alignment was perfect, a symphony of sabotage conducted across centuries. And then he saw it, a symbol so small he had previously dismissed it as a scribe's stray ink blot. There, in the margin of the scroll, beside a passage detailing the corruption of a Númenorian lord, was a clear, tiny drawing. A serpent, coiled tightly around a stone tower, his breath caught in his throat. "I have seen this mark," he whispered, the words feeling like shards of ice. In the court of King Eärendil, it was etched into the pommel of a jeweled dagger worn by the lord who mocked my claims. It was woven into the embroidery on the sleeve of the steward who called my life's work a treasonous obsession. The symbol was not just an ancient sigil, it was a brand of allegiance, worn openly by the very men who had dismissed his warning. The conspiracy was not a ghost of the past. It was alive, its agents sitting in the highest seats of power in Arnor, whispering poison into the king's ear while wearing its emblem as a badge of honor. The architect's reach was not a historical fact. It was the very air the kingdom now breathed. If the enemy was inside the walls, who could the king possibly trust? The serpent in the tower marked a clear path, one that led from the polished halls of Númenor into the haunted lands of Caelen. The Barrow Downs rose before them like a frozen sea of grass-covered mounds, each one a grave for kings of a lost age. The air grew cold and still, a deep silence that seemed to swallow all sound. Caelen moved with a new tension, his eyes scanning the unnatural hillocks. "This is a place of wrath and memory," he whispered. "The men of Westernness sealed these tombs with more than stone. They bound them with ancient spells to keep the dead within and the living out. Yet their only hope, a chronicle said to be buried with a lord who defied the early whispers of the architects, lay in one of those sealed chambers. Elaran knew that his scholarly tools were useless here. The only way in was with a light that no mortal flame could provide. From a small pouch, he produced a single, clear elven gem, a legacy of his people's craft. It held no heat, but when he spoke a soft word in his own tongue, it kindled with a pure, white radiance that pushed back the oppressive gloom. It was a necessary risk, a beacon in a place that hated all light. The gem's glow found the hidden entrance, a stone door carved with fading wards. As the light touched the ancient seal, the stone groaned inward, revealing a dark passage. But the light did more than reveal their path. From the surrounding barrows came a low, answering groan, a sound of ancient malice stirred from slumber. Shadows began to writhe and coalesce at the edges of the light, forming into tall, gaunt shapes with eyes of cold fire. The Barrow Wights were awake. Their desperate race into the dark began. The air inside the tomb was thick with the dust of centuries and a chilling presence that sought to sap their will. Elaran's gem illuminated walls covered in carved histories, but the whites were close behind, their silent advance more terrifying than any battle cry. Caelen stood at the entrance, his sword a pale glint in the elven light, holding the threshold against the grasping, spectral forms. "Find it," he growled, his voice strained. "Find it now." Elaran scrambled deeper into the tomb, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ignored golden arm rings and jeweled helms, his eyes searching for the true treasure, a stone chest resting on a central plinth. He threw open the lid, and there it lay, not a crown or a sword, but a bundle of wax-sealed parchment, the chronicle they sought. At that moment, a terrible cold swept through the chamber. The stone door began to grind shut, the white's power sealing them inside. Caelen threw his shoulder against the stone, his boots sliding on the dusty floor. Elaran clutched the chronicle to his chest, the gem's light flickering as the darkness and the dead closed in. Could knowledge truly be worth a fate of being entombed alive with the vengeful dead? The stone door groaned to a halt, leaving them sealed in a tomb, thick with the chill of the dead. By the flickering light of the elven gem, Elaran broke the wax seal on the chronicle. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the words written by the long-dead Lord of Caelen were devastatingly clear. They spoke of a figure known only as the Whisperer, a voice of cunning reason in the court of the great Númenorian king, Tar-Minastir. This was no brutish agent of the enemy, but a counselor of subtlety and grace. The chronicle detailed how, generations before Númenor's pride swelled into arrogance, the Whisperer had worked to sever its ancient bonds. He did not rant or demand. He murmured. He would lament the burdens placed upon Númenor by its elven allies, framing their eternal vigilance as a chain. He would question the cost of sending their fleets to aid distant lands, planting the seed that such generosity was a weakness. He turned gratitude into grievance and fellowship into a fool's errand, patiently steering a mighty kingdom toward isolation and pride. Elaran read the passages aloud, his voice a soft echo in the silent chamber. Caelen listened, his back against the cold stone of the door, his face a mask. Then a name in the chronicle struck him like a physical blow. It was the name of his own ancestor, a Dúnedain lord of that age. The text did not paint him as a villain, but as a tragic figure, a man of honor gradually twisted by the Whisperer's insidious logic. The chronicle revealed that Caelen's forefather had been the one to argue most passionately against sending aid to the elves during a great war, a decision that had fractured old alliances and set a perilous new course. This was not some abstract historical failing. This was the shame of his own bloodline, the reason his family's name had faded from the royal courts, a truth buried here in the dark to protect their honor. A fierce conflict ignited within the ranger. His entire life was built upon a duty to protect the legacy of his people, a legacy he believed was pure. Now he was confronted with the fact that the very shadow he fought against had once coiled itself around the heart of his family. The desire to cast the chronicle into the darkness, to let this shame be buried forever, was a powerful, aching impulse. To protect his family's name was to deny the very truth that could save his kingdom. He looked at Elaran, the elf who had unearthed this painful secret, and he saw not an accuser, but a fellow seeker of a terrible truth. In that moment, the last wall of distrust between them crumbled to dust. Their bond was no longer just one of shared survival, but of shared burden. The quest was no longer Elaran's alone. It was theirs. The past was not a foreign country to be studied from afar. It was a ghost that lived in their very blood, and its whispers still echoed in the halls of power today. How many other families, he wondered, carried a similar shame hidden in their history, a secret loyalty to a shadow they no longer even recognized. The Chronicle's secrets were a locked door, written in a dialect of westernness, so archaic, even Elaran struggled. Their only hope was a translator, and the closest place to find such a person, without drawing the direct attention of the king's court, was the bustling, crowded town of Bree. Its streets were a chaotic symphony of farmers, merchants, and travelers, a place where anonymity was the only true currency. But for an elf, anonymity was impossible. Elaran's height, his sharp features, and the subtle light in his eyes drew stares the moment they passed through the town gate. Whispers followed them like a trailing shadow. Caelen led them to a dimly lit inn called the Prancing Pony, its common room thick with smoke and the murmur of a dozen different conversations. He made discreet inquiries and learned of a man named Forthon, a dealer in old scrolls and forgotten tales who kept a small shop near the market square. He was their best chance. Elaran, driven by a scholar's desperate need for answers, made the critical mistake. He approached Forthon directly in his shop, the Chronicle tucked under his arm. The Loremaster was a gaunt man with eyes that darted like a hunted animal's. He took one look at the text, then at Elaran's face, and his price for translation became absurdly high, a clear attempt at extortion. Worse, his gaze kept flicking toward the door. Sensing a trap, Elaran withdrew, but the damage was done. That night, as a cold rain began to fall, turning the alleys into rivers of mud and reflected lantern light, they were ambushed. Two men emerged from the gloom, their knives glinting. They were not royal guards or Dunlending tribesmen. They were cutthroats from Bree's underworld, their movements efficient and brutal. This was not a political arrest. It was an assassination. The fight was a short, vicious affair in the tight, slippery space. Caelen moved with the deadly grace of his training, disarming one man and slamming him against a wall. Elaran, armed only with a walking staff, barely parried a thrust aimed for his throat. The second assailant, seeing his partner fall, did not flee. Instead, he spat a single word at them, his voice a venomous hiss. Architect. Then he melted back into the maze of alleys, leaving them standing in the rain, their hearts pounding. The word was a confirmation more terrifying than any attack. Their enemy was not confined to royal courts or ancient tombs. It had tendrils here, in this common, crowded haven, buying the services of cutthroats with a word that should have been meaningless. As they fled Bree under the cover of the downpour, a new, chilling reality settled over them. They could trust no one. Every stranger's face was a potential mask, every offered hand a possible dagger. Their quest had just shrunk the entire world into a territory of shadows. The Loremaster's final breath was a price paid in blood. As the man lay dying in the muddy alley, his life seeping away from the wound meant for Elaran, he gasped a single, fractured name. Karaz, the last keeper of the true records in Tharbad. The name was a gift and a curse, a single thread of hope in a tightening noose. but the cost was immediate. A witness, a cloth dyer who had seen the struggle from her window, screamed for the town watch. In moments, the ringing of a bell echoed through the rain-swept streets of Bree, a sound that turned every closed door into a barrier and every face in a window into a potential accuser. They were no longer merely pursued by shadows. They were now fugitives, wanted for murder in the eyes of the common folk. Their world, already dangerous, shrank to a single, desperate road leading south to the drowned ruins of Tharbad. Every friendly hearth was now a potential trap, every offer of help a possible betrayal. The name Karaz was the only compass they had left, pointing toward a city that was itself a tomb, a place swallowed by marsh and memory. The quest for truth had forced them to trade the trust of an entire town for one dying man's whisper. Was a name whispered in the mud worth becoming a monster in the eyes of those they had hoped to save? Their path forward was now a razor's edge, with the law on one side and the architects on the other. The rain never seemed to cease, turning the road south into a ribbon of churned mud. Their only landmark was the growing roar of the river Guatdo, a wide, swift-moving barrier on the path to the ruins of Tharbad. The ancient ford was their only hope for crossing, a place of submerged stones remembered only on the oldest of Caelen's maps. As they approached the bank under the cover of a moonless night, the air felt wrong, too still and too quiet, the rush of the water the only sound. Then, from the reeds and the overhanging willows, dark shapes detached themselves. They were not soldiers, but river pirates, lean and hardened men who knew the currents better than any road. Their blades were not for show, and their orders were clear. They moved to encircle the two travelers, cutting off any retreat, their silence more menacing than any war cry. These were not random brigands. They had been waiting, their ambush set at the one place Elaran and Caelen had to cross. The architect's reach extended even to the scum of the riverways, their coin buying loyalty as easily in a pirate's den as in a king's court. Caelen took in the situation with a single, sweeping glance. A direct fight against so many on unstable ground was a death sentence. Their only path was through the river itself. He made the choice in a heartbeat, a desperate gamble against the cold. He shoved Elaran toward the water's edge, his voice a low, urgent command. Into the river. Now, do not stop for anything. To buy them a precious moment. He did not follow immediately. Instead, he threw his own pack, heavy with their remaining food and gear, far down the bank in the opposite direction. It landed with a solid thud, and he sent a loose stone skittering after it. The pirates, thinking their prey was fleeing on land, hesitated for a crucial second, their attention divided. It was all the time they needed. Elaran plunged into the Guatdo, the cold a physical blow that stole his breath. The current was a powerful, living thing, pulling at his legs, threatening to drag him under. Caelen was right behind him, his strong strokes keeping them both afloat and on course. They did not try to swim across, but let the river carry them downstream, away from the ford and the shouts of their confused pursuers. The water was a freezing agony, numbing their limbs and sapping their strength with every yard. When they finally dragged themselves onto the far bank, miles downstream, they were shaking uncontrollably, their clothes frozen to their skin. They had escaped with their lives, but the cost was total. Their food, their dry tinder, Caelen's extra arrows, the last of their coin, everything was gone, lost to the river or the pirates. They stood shivering in the darkness, two silhouettes against the vast, empty wilderland, with nothing but the soaked clothes on their backs and the name of a drowned city to guide them. The first flurries of snow began to fall, stinging their faces. The cold of the river was now a permanent chill in their bones, a stark reminder that the elements themselves had become another weapon in the architect's arsenal. How far could two men, stripped of every resource, travel in a land turning to ice, pursued by an enemy who seemed to command both men and nature? The flooded ruins of Tharbad rose from the marsh like the bones of a forgotten giant, a skeletal city picked clean by time and the river. They found Karas in the highest room of a tower that leaned precariously over the dark water, a gaunt old man whose eyes held the fractured light of long solitude. He greeted them not with words, but with a drawn blade, his movements brittle with a fear that had festered into madness. He was the last keeper of a dead city's memory, and he saw every stranger as the final agent of his long-expected doom. Elaran did not raise his own hands in threat. Instead, he spoke, his voice steady, a single phrase from the Chronicle of the Barrow Downs, a line about the silence that kills kingdoms from within. The effect was immediate. The blade in Karas' hand trembled, then lowered, the hostility in his eyes shattered, replaced by a profound and weary relief. "You," he whispered, his voice cracking from disuse. "You are the one. I have been waiting." He led them through a maze of fallen beams and water-stained shelves to a small, sealed chamber. Here, protected by waxed cloth and layers of old spells against the damp, was his life's work, the true archive of Tharbad. His cooperation, however, was laced with a palpable terror. As he unrolled a massive vellum map, tracing the old alliances of Arnor, his hands shook. He confirmed their worst fears, his finger stabbing at the symbol of the serpent and the tower. "It is not a single traitor you hunt," he said, his voice dropping to a conspirator's hush. "It is a bloodline, a lineage of betrayal that has flowed through the veins of the Dunedain for generations, a poison passed from father to son. They are the architect's greatest triumph, men who believe they serve the kingdom even as they methodically prepare its grave." And then he gave them the terrible warning, the reason for his hiding and his madness. "The traitor is not some distant lord in a far-off hold. He is among the chieftains of the Dunedain themselves, a man you would call a brother. He guards the northern passes. He knows every secret path your people take. He has eaten at your fire and shared your salt." Karas' words hung in the dusty air, a condemnation that turned every ally into a suspect. The conspiracy was not just in the king's court. It had burrowed deep into the very heart of the Rangers, the last faithful guardians of the realm. To trust the wrong person now would not just end their quest. It would deliver them directly into the hands of the enemy they sought to expose. How do you fight a shadow that wears the face of a friend? The air in that high tower was thick with the dust of betrayal. Karas unfurled a brittle ledger, its pages a meticulous record of the kingdom's sickness. Here was the poison, written in a neat, administrative hand. It detailed how the architects had worked not with armies, but with parchment and lies. Forged letters, purportedly from the lords of Caelen, were sent to Númenor, each one dripping with arrogant demands and subtle threats. At the same time, poisoned gifts, beautiful artifacts laced with a slow-acting malady, were dispatched to the court of Caelen, each one bearing the royal seal of Arnor. It was a masterwork of sabotage, designed to turn brother against brother, to make each kingdom believe the other was the source of all its woes. Caelen leaned in, his eyes scanning the entries, his face a mask of grim concentration. Then he stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He knew this handwriting. It was the same steady, precise script used by his own captain, a man named Baronner, to write field reports and commendations. This was not the work of a distant, faceless lord. It was the work of a man who had shared his campfire, a man he had trusted with his life on countless patrols. The betrayal was a physical blow, a cold knife, twisting in the gut of his very identity. His loyalty to the Rangers, the code that defined his entire existence, was now a chain linking him to the conspiracy itself. A silent, furious war erupted within him. One part screamed for immediate, violent justice, to ride north and confront Baronner, to force a confession at the point of a blade. It was the righteous fury of a man whose trust had been shattered, but the cooler, more strategic part of his mind, the part forged in the wilds, knew the danger. A direct accusation would be his word against that of a decorated captain. Baronner would simply deny it, and Caelen would be branded a traitor and a madman, silenced forever. They needed more than a ledger page and a claim of recognized handwriting. They needed irrefutable proof, something that could not be explained away. The choice was agonizing. To act now was to risk everything on a single, emotional confrontation. To wait was to allow the poison to spread further, all while knowing the viper rested in their own nest. He looked from the damning page to Elaran's concerned face, and then to the fearful eyes of Kara's. The path of the warrior demanded a swift strike. The path of the guardian demanded patient, painful proof. His next decision would determine not only their fate, but the fate of the entire north. The cold wind atop the watchtower whipped Caelen's cloak like a banner of accusation. He found Captain Baronner alone on the high parapet, staring out over the mist-shrouded valleys he was sworn to protect. There was no greeting, only the heavy silence between them, thick with unspoken truths. Caelen's voice was low and raw as he confronted the man, citing the ledger's script, the pattern of forged letters, the poisoned gifts that had shattered the sister kingdom of Caelen. Baronner did not startle or deny. He simply turned, his face a mask of weary resignation, and in his eyes, Caelen saw the confirmation of every terrible suspicion. This was not a monster, but a man he had called brother. Their swords rang out in the thin air, a bitter music against the howl of the wind. The duel was not one of flashy skill, but of brutal, efficient strikes born of a shared training, each man knowing the other's every move. They were mirror images, one fighting for a truth he could no longer deny, the other for a lie he could no longer escape. Caelen pressed his advantage, driving Baronner back toward the edge of the battlements, until with a final, desperate parry, the captain's sword clattered from his grasp. Baronner sank to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps, a dark stain spreading across his tunic. He looked up at Caelen, and there was no hatred in his gaze, only a profound and chilling pity. "You think you have slain the serpent," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the gale. "You have only cut a single scale from its skin. I was a guardian, just like you. I believed my orders came from the highest authority, from a voice of such ancient lineage and power, that to question it was to betray Arnor itself. The true architect is not some exiled lord skulking in the shadows. The voice that commands this great work sits upon a throne of stone and starlight. The confession stole the breath from Caelen's lungs. The conspiracy was not a corruption of the kingdom's body. It was the will of its very heart, a poison brewed in the highest seat of all. The enemy was not at the gates. The enemy was the one who gave the orders, the one whom every ranger, including Caelen himself, had sworn a blood oath to obey without question. His faith, the foundation upon which his entire life had been built, crumbled to dust in that windswept moment, leaving him standing on the edge of an abyss. If the one you are sworn to protect is the very source of the shadow, where does your duty lie? The captain's dying words reordered the entire world. A throne of stone and starlight could only mean one thing: the elven king Gil-galad in Lindon, the last high king of the Noldor in Middle-earth, the one ally whose power had always shielded the free peoples from the shadow. The revelation was so monstrous it felt like the ground itself had fallen away. This was not a simple betrayal of men by men. It was a corruption of the very pinnacle of elven nobility, a perversion of the oldest and purest power left in the world. Caelen stood frozen on the windswept tower, the cold seeping into a heart already numb with disbelief. If Gil-galad was the true architect, then every scroll, every chronicle, every whispered warning was part of a design centuries in the making. Elaran's mind, trained to trace patterns across ages, now saw the horrifying symmetry. The conspiracy's ultimate goal was not merely the fall of Arnor. It was to reenact the drowning of Númenor itself. In that drowned kingdom's final days, a proud king was manipulated by Sauron's whispers into building a grand armada, a fleet of such immense pride that he sought to sail into the undying lands and challenge the gods themselves. The Valor, the guardians of the world, had answered that hubris by breaking the world, swallowing the island and all its glory beneath the sea. And now, the same pattern was being woven again. The whispers in the court of Númenor, the forged letters, the poisoned alliances, it was all a prelude, a carefully staged drama to isolate the current king and fill his ears with a similar poisonous pride. The goal was to manipulate him into building his own great fleet, to challenge not the Valor directly, but their representatives, the elves, shattering the last alliance and bringing down a divine wrath upon the entire kingdom. Their mission shattered and reformed in that instant. It was no longer about uncovering a historical truth or even exposing a traitor. It was about preventing a cataclysm. They were not historians anymore. They were the only shield between a king's pride and his kingdom's utter annihilation. The fate of Arnor no longer hung on a battle or a siege, but on a single, terrible choice they had to stop a king from making. How do you warn a king that his most trusted ally, a figure of legend and light, is secretly engineering his doom? The salt-scoured docks of Londare echoed with a frantic, orchestrated energy. Under a slate-gray sky, the rhythmic pounding of 1,000 hammers was a drumbeat for a kingdom's pride. Great ribs of ships, skeletons of a promised fleet, rose along the shoreline, their scale dwarfing the men who swarmed over them. This was the king's grand armada, the very project their grim revelation had warned them about. It was no longer a theory in a dusty ledger. It was pine tar and sweat and the groaning of green timber, a tangible path to doom. To stop it, they needed to get inside the machine and find its architect. Elaran shed his traveling cloak for the humble robe of a scribe, his elven grace subdued into the weary stoop of a scholar for hire. He presented himself at the shipyard's main ledger house as a translator from the northern libraries, offering his skill with old Númenorian ship designs. The harried overseers, drowning in logistics, barely glanced at him before thrusting a stylus into his hand and pointing him toward a mountain of supply manifests. It was a perfect disguise, placing him at the very heart of the operation, surrounded by the paperwork of its ambition. For days, he meticulously recorded orders for timber, cordage, and iron, all the while listening. He heard the shipwrights speak in hushed, worried tones about the advisor who walked the yards at dusk, a man named Surian. They said he carried a staff of black wood and would chant in a tongue that made the sea fog coil and cling. Elaran's blood ran cold. He remembered the chronicle's description of the rites used to inflame the pride of Númenor's last king, ceremonies meant to bind mortal ambition to a darker will. One evening, hidden behind a stack of rolled sailcloth, he witnessed it. Surian stood at the water's edge, his voice a low hum that seemed to vibrate in the very planks of the docks. He was not praying for safe passage or fair winds. He was reciting the lay of Ar-Pharazôn, the epic of the king who challenged the gods. He twisted the words, turning a tale of tragic hubris into a stirring anthem of destiny, a call for the men of honor to seize what was rightfully theirs from the jealous elves across the sea. This was the poison, distilled into ritual. The advisor was not just giving counsel, he was performing a dark sacrament, using the ghost of a drowned kingdom to seduce a living one into the same fatal current. Every nail driven into a hull, every rope woven into rigging, was another stitch in a shroud woven from the same arrogant thread that had once pulled an island beneath the waves. How do you reason with a pride that is being systematically, ceremonially manufactured? Lord Valandor held court in a chamber overlooking the shipyards, the constant hammering a percussive backdrop to his smooth, reasonable voice. Elaran, standing humbly among the scribes, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sea air. The advisor's words were a masterwork of persuasion, framing the fleet not as an act of defiance, but as a necessary assertion of man's rightful place in the world. He spoke of elven gatekeepers hoarding wisdom and light, of a destiny long delayed, and with every sentence, Elaran heard the ghost of another voice, the same rhetorical patterns, the same careful stoking of grievance, and pride that the chronicle had attributed to the whisperer in Tar Minister's court centuries before. The script was identical, only the actors had changed. He watched the king, a good man burdened by the crown, listening intently, his resolve hardening with every elegant phrase. Elaran knew then that ledgers and historical parallels were useless here. The poison was being administered live, in this very room, and silence was complicity. He stepped forward, his scribe's robe feeling like a pathetic disguise. "My lord," he said, his voice cutting through Valandor's oratory, "I have studied the scrolls of Númenor. What you propose, these very words, were spoken before its fall. This is not destiny, it is a trap." The chamber fell utterly silent. Lord Valandor turned, his face a mask of calm amusement that did not reach his cold eyes. He did not address the accusation. He simply looked to the king and said, "This elf, or his agent, seeks to sow doubt and fear where we must have courage. He would have us cower rather than claim our future. It is the oldest trick of those who wish to keep us subservient. The charge of treason was not a roar, but a quiet, inevitable conclusion. Guards seized Elaran's arms. As he was dragged away, his eyes met Valandor's for a single, piercing moment, and in that glance, he saw not an advisor, but an artist admiring his own perfect work. Thrust into the city's dungeons, the cold, damp stone, a stark contrast to the lofty halls, Elaran knew his fate was sealed. His public challenge had been a necessary gambit, but it had failed. Now he was a loose end to be permanently silenced. Caelen, watching from the shadows of the crowd, saw the arrest not as a defeat, but as the activation of a contingency plan they had never dared to voice. His friend was in a cage, and the only way out was through the sword. The city guard was a force he knew intimately, their patrol routes and routines etched into his memory. He moved through the lower city like a wraith, assembling the tools of a jailbreak, not from a merchant's stall, but from the city's own neglected corners. A length of discarded rope, a guard's cloak left unattended, a key ring lifted from a dozing sentry. His rescue was not a grand assault, but a patient, deadly dance of misdirection and quiet violence. He created a disturbance at a barracks gate, drawing half the dungeon guards away, then slipped into the now undermanned keep. The few men standing between him and Elaran's cell were not enemies he hated, but brothers in arms he had to strike down without a sound. He found Elaran in a windowless cell, the door already groaning open as a nervous turnkey checked the commotion outside. Caelen's hand clamped over the man's mouth, and a swift, precise strike rendered him unconscious. There was no time for reunion. "We have to move," Caelen whispered, his voice tight. "They will be coming for you at dawn." Their escape back into the teeming, anonymous streets was a blur of shadows and held breath. They were both fugitives now, utterly severed from the kingdom they were trying to save. Elaran's truth had been declared a lie, and Caelen's loyalty had been branded a crime. With the king's ear firmly closed and the full power of the state turned against them, what possible path remained to stop an armada built on pride and a prophecy of ruin? The storm broke over Númenor with a fury that felt like a judgment. Rain lashed the white stone buildings, turning streets into torrents, and driving even the most diligent guards to seek shelter. For Caelen, the tempest was a gift. He moved through the deluge not as a fugitive, but as a captain again, seeking out the few rangers whose loyalty was to the land itself, not just the crown currently upon its head. He found them in damp guardhouses and quiet tavern corners, men whose eyes held the same doubt he had once felt. He did not offer them proof from dusty ledgers. He spoke of their captain, Baranor, and the truth of his final confession. He spoke of an elven king manipulating their own, and of a fleet being built to sail into a divine storm. He asked not for blind faith, but for a single act of defiance against the coming darkness. A handful agreed, their trust in Caelen outweighing their fear of treason. The raid was a brief, violent explosion in the heart of the storm. They struck the dungeon's side entry, using the thunder to mask the splintering of the lock. Inside, the few guards on duty were overwhelmed with swift, precise force, disarmed and bound before they could raise an alarm. Caelen found Elaran in his cell, the elf's face pale in a flash of lightning. There was no time for words, only the press of a hilt into his hand before they were moving again. a small knot of shadows fleeing back into the sheeting rain. Their escape was a desperate scramble down rain-slicked alleys to a forgotten wharf. The only vessel they could commandeer was a weathered fishing smack, its single mast swaying violently in the gale. They cut the lines and pushed off into the churning harbor, the wind catching the sail and hurling them out into the open, black water. Huddled in the pitching boat, soaked and shivering, they watched the lanterns of the city recede into the stormy gloom. They were free, but they were now officially outlaws. A price would be on their heads by morning, and the king's grand armada sat in the harbor behind them, its near complete hulls a silent promise of ruin. They had rescued the truth, but they were now adrift with it on a hostile sea, hunted by the very kingdom they had sworn to save. What refuge remains for those branded as traitors by the land they are trying to protect? The storm-tossed fishing smack was little more than driftwood when the waves finally spat it onto a gravel beach. They collapsed in the sodden dark, the roar of the gale still echoing in their ears. As dawn bled a gray light through the lingering mist, they saw they had been delivered to a narrow, hidden cove, its high cliffs draped in thick pine, a place that felt outside of time itself. The air smelled of salt and cold stone, and the silence was profound. Figures emerged from the trees, not with weapons drawn, but with a quiet, solemn curiosity. They were led to a small settlement of stone huts, built into the cliff face, a community that called itself the Remnant. These were the descendants of the faithful, the few Númenorians who had rejected the pride of their kings and escaped the downfall. Here, they preserved the old ways, not as a dead tradition, but as a living truth. An elder named Eärendil, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and wisdom, offered them warmth and food. As they spoke of their flight from Númenor and the king's mad armada, the old man listened, his eyes growing heavy with a sorrow that was centuries deep. "You have looked upon the face of your enemy and seen only a man," he said, his voice soft as the embers in the hearth. "But the one you call Lord Valandor is no man. He is Uleri, one of the 9. He walks in an unseen form, and the face he shows the king is a glamour, a lie woven from shadow. The true architect is a ringwraith, a servant of the Dark Lord, hiding in plain sight." The revelation struck them with a physical force. A ringwraith, not some corrupted counselor, but a being of pure malice, a specter from the darkest ballads, now steering a kingdom to its doom. Eärendil explained that such a creature could not exert its will so completely without a focus, a conduit for its power. He led them to a simple stone altar at the back of his dwelling. Upon it rested a seeing stone, a palantir, but this one was unlike any other. It was dark, its deep obsidian sphere not reflecting light, but seeming to drink it. This was not a tool of communication, but of coercion, a perverted stone used to pour whispers directly into a mortal mind, to twist sight and seed delusion. The Grand Armada, the king's unshakable pride, it was not born of his own heart. It was a phantom planted there, a waking dream fed to him through this corrupted crystal by a wraith wearing a trusted face. The conspiracy was far older, deeper, and more terrible than they had ever dared to fear. Their enemy was not a flawed man they could reason with, but a ghost with a crown of shadows. How do you fight a nightmare that has already convinced the king it is his most cherished dream? The Scepter of Lies was not merely a weapon, but a poison for the mind. The elders described its creation in the fires of Orodruin, a tool forged not to kill the body, but to murder truth itself. It amplified a single, whispered falsehood, turning it into an unshakable conviction in the heart of its victim. The king's pride was not his own. It was a phantom echo, a lie given royal power by this artifact. Elaran understood with a chilling finality that ledgers and warnings were useless against such sorcery. You could not argue with a man who was dreaming with his eyes open. The only way to break the spell was to break the scepter, but the tool of deception was kept in the most secure place imaginable, the royal citadel of Númenor, and it would only be brought forth for one occasion, the grand blessing of the fleet before its launch. Their only chance to reach it was to walk directly into the heart of their enemy's triumph, a fortress swarming with guards, in front of a king who saw them as traitors, and a wraith who knew their every intention. The plan was a form of madness, a desperate strike at the exact moment the kingdom's defenses and arrogance would be at their peak. How do you shatter a lie when it is being celebrated as the nation's greatest truth? The city of Númenor was a glittering jewel of celebration, its white walls bathed in the warm glow of 1,000 lanterns. Laughter and music spilled from the great hall, a cacophony of triumph that masked their return. Dressed in the plain wool and leather of wine merchants from the south, Elaran and Caelen moved through the bustling crowds with their heads down, pushing a handcart laden with casks. The air was thick with the smells of roasted meat and spiced wine, a heady aroma of misplaced victory. Every guard was posted along the main thoroughfares, their attention fixed on the spectacle, making the outer corridors of the citadel quieter, a shadowed periphery to the central feast. This was the Feast of Fools, and they were the uninvited guests. Caelen's role was one of calculated clumsiness. He waited for the perfect moment when a particularly pompous lord, his tunic embroidered with the serpent and tower sigil, was holding forth to a captivated circle of admirers. With a carefully timed stumble, Caelen lurched forward, the clay jug in his hand seeming to slip. Dark red wine erupted from the vessel, splashing across the lord's pristine silks. The man's outraged cry cut through the merriment like a knife. Instantly, the scene devolved into chaos shouts of alarm, the lord sputtering in fury, and guards rushing to contain the disturbance and apprehend the drunken merchant. In that precious window of confusion, as all eyes turned to the spectacle, Elaran melted away from the cart and into a side passage, a shadow detaching itself from the light. While Caelen played his part in the commotion, buying them time with feigned apologies and a convincing performance of inebriated terror, Elaran moved through the silent upper levels. His elven feet made no sound on the cold stone floors. The royal quarters felt abandoned, the sounds of the feast a distant murmur. He moved with a purpose born of desperation, his senses stretched to their limit, searching for any sign of the scepter's dark presence. He knew it had to be close, prepared for the dawn's grand ceremony. Every moment counted, each heartbeat a grain of sand, falling in an hourglass that measured the lifespan of a kingdom. The success of their entire mad endeavor now rested on a split-second diversion and the silent steps of a single elf in the enemy's innermost sanctum. Could a spilled cup of wine truly be enough to change the fate of nations? The door to the king's chamber gave way without a sound. Inside, the air was still and cold, smelling of beeswax and dried herbs. On a velvet-draped stand, Resting between the king's crown and a ceremonial sword lay the Scepter of Lies. It was a slender rod of obsidian, and at its tip, a single malevolent gem pulsed with a soft violet light. Elaran stepped toward it, his hand outstretched, but as his fingers neared the cold stone, the world dissolved around him. The chamber walls melted into the rain-slicked alleys of Bree. He saw the Loremaster forth on, not as a dying extortionist, but as a terrified old man, his eyes pleading as Caelen's blade took his life. A voice, smooth as silk and cold as ice, whispered in his mind. "This is your doing. Your quest for knowledge is a trail of bodies. You are no savior. You are a curse." The vision shifted. He stood on the deck of the king's great flagship as it sailed into a titanic wave, the screams of thousands swallowed by the sea, and he knew with absolute certainty that his failure had doomed them all. Despair, thick and heavy as a burial shroud, wrapped around his heart, urging him to fall to his knees and surrender. What was the point of fighting a shadow that turned every victory into ash? Then, through the crushing weight of the illusion, another memory surfaced, sharp and clear. The fear in Karas' eyes in the drowned tower of Tharbad, not for himself, but for the truth he had guarded for so long. The old man's final, whispered warning, "You are the one. I have been waiting." That sacrifice, that lonely vigil against the darkness, was a light the Scepter's lies could not extinguish. Karas had given everything for this moment. He would not let that sacrifice be in vain. With a cry that was part anguish and part defiance, Elaran tore his gaze from the phantoms of his failure. He drew the elven dagger from his belt, its blade glowing with a soft, silver radiance that was the antithesis of the scepter's violet gloom. He did not grab the scepter. He brought the dagger down upon it with all his strength. The obsidian rod shattered with a sound that was not of this world, a silent, psychic scream that tore through the minds of everyone in the citadel. The violet light in the gem flared once, blindingly, and then died forever. For a single, breathless heartbeat, there was perfect silence. Then, from the hall below, came the first shout of alarm. The glamour was broken, and the hunters were now awake. The psychic shriek of the shattered scepter echoed not in the air, but in the mind. Down in the great hall, the music died mid-note. King Valendil, who had been raising a golden goblet in a toast to his grand armada, froze, his triumphant expression shattered, replaced by a dawning, gut-wrenching horror as he stared through the high windows at the forest of masts in his harbor. He saw not a symbol of destiny, but a fleet of floating tombs, a monument to a pride that was not his own. The phantom conviction that had filled him for months evaporated, leaving only the cold, sickening truth. He had been puppeted, his will a hollow vessel for a shadow's design. Across the hall, Lord Valendor convulsed. The handsome, reassuring features of the king's counselor shimmered like a mirage, then dissolved entirely. In his place stood a tall, gaunt figure clad in robes of darkness that seemed to drink the very light from the room. Where a face should have been, there was only a deep, empty hood from which gleamed 2 points of cold, pale fire. The Ringwraith, its disguise torn away, raised a skeletal hand. It did not speak with a mortal voice, but issued a command that tore at the fabric of the world, a summons that pierced the clouds above the city. From the weeping sky, answering shrieks echoed, and fell beasts with leathern wings and serpentine necks descended upon the citadel, their shadows falling across the panicked crowd like a plague. The ordered celebration shattered into absolute chaos. Nobles and servants alike screamed and scrambled for cover as the creatures landed on parapets, their claws scraping against white stone. The Ringwraith, now fully revealed as the architect of this ruin, turned its baleful gaze toward the upper levels, toward the source of its undoing. Elaran and Caelen were no longer saboteurs in the shadows. They were the only barrier between a city and its annihilation. This was no longer a battle of whispers and ledgers, but a final, direct confrontation with the very soul of the shadow. The sky itself had become the enemy. Great winged beasts circled the citadel's highest towers, their shrieks rending the air as their riders, the Nazgul, directed the assault with silent, malevolent purpose. Stone shattered where their claws gripped the parapets, sending cascades of white marble crashing into the courtyards below. Elaran and Caelen, no longer fugitives, found themselves thrust into command of the king's own guard, their desperate authority accepted in the face of an unimaginable threat. They organized a desperate defense, a thin line of men with bows and spears against a nightmare given wings. But arrows were little more than gnats to the thick-hided creatures, and the guard's courage was beginning to fracture under the onslaught. Caelen's eyes scanned the chaotic battlement, his warrior's mind seeking any advantage, any weapon. His gaze fixed on a lone, massive ballista mounted on an isolated spire across a wide gap where the ramparts had collapsed. It was their only chance to bring down one of the flying terrors. The only path was a deadly swing across the open air. Elaran produced the elven ropes from his pack, their slender strands stronger than any steel cable forged by man. Tying one end to a sturdy merlon, Caelen did not hesitate. He took the coiled line, ran 3 swift steps, and launched himself into the void. The rope sang as he arced across the gulf, the world a dizzying blur of sky, stone, and diving shadows. He landed hard on the far platform, his hands already working the heavy winch of the ballista, loading a spear-sized bolt. Taking aim at a creature swooping low to scatter the defenders, he fired. The great bolt struck true, punching through the beast's wing joint with a sickening crack. It spiraled from the sky, its rider's shriek of fury, a psychic wave of pure hate that washed over the citadel. But the victory was fleeting. The fallen beast's crash drew immediate attention. From stairwells and crumbling archways, the Ringwraith's mortal minions, grim-faced men with the serpent and tower sigil on their shields, swarmed onto the spire, cutting off Caelen's retreat. He stood alone, his back to the precipice, his sword a sliver of light against the closing circle of shadows. He had traded one certain death for another, a desperate gamble that had saved the king, but now left him surrounded and isolated. What use was bringing down a single beast if it cost them their most capable warrior at the moment they needed him most? A desperate cry ripped from Elaran's throat as he saw Caelen's peril across the shattered rampart. The ranger was a fortress of defiance, but the tide of enemies was endless. In that moment of absolute despair, Elaran's hand went to a small, forgotten weight against his chest. A crystal vial hung from a simple chain. He had carried it in silence, a final gift from a lady of light in a far-off golden wood, a treasure he believed was meant for a hope he could not yet see. Now he understood its purpose. He scrambled to the highest point of the citadel, the wind tearing at his robes, and uncorked the phial. It did not simply glow. It drank the fading daylight and gave birth to a new star in the palm of his hand. This was not the harsh light of the sun, but the pure, ancient radiance of the morning star, Eärendil, a light that recalled the heavens before shadow fell upon the world. He raised it high, and the darkness recoiled. The winged beasts shrieked and beat backwards, their forms smoking where the light touched their hides. The mortal minions faltered, shielding their eyes from a brilliance that felt like judgment. But the true wound was dealt to the Nazgul. The Ringwraith, its form of gathered night, shuddered violently as if struck by a physical blow. A piercing, silent scream of agony echoed in every mind, a sound of pure malice confronted by a purity it could not endure. Its power, which had moments before commanded the very sky, fractured and fled before that unassailable light. The crushing despair that had gripped the defenders shattered like glass. A ragged cheer went up from the king's guard, their broken line reforming, their courage flooding back as the physical and spiritual assault broke against Elaran's solitary stand. The remaining Ringwraith, wounded and furious, gathered its tattered form upon its steed. It did not speak to the ears, but its final thought was a poison-tipped spear aimed directly at Elaran's heart. This land is mine by right of blood and shadow. I have slept in its stone and drunk from its rivers of memory. You have won a moment, little star, but not the war. We will return when your light has guttered and failed. With a last, hate-filled shriek that faded into the wind, the creature and its foul kin wheeled and vanished into the storm-racked east. The immediate battle was over, but the victory felt hollow, a single breath drawn before a plunge into deeper waters. The enemy was not defeated, only delayed, and its promise of return hung in the air, colder and more certain than the winter wind. What do you do when the shadow does not flee, but merely retreats to gather its strength for a final, consuming night? Silence returned to the White City, a fragile thing woven from exhaustion and the lingering chill of the Wraith's departure. In the great hall, now scarred by claw and shadow, King Valandil stood before his people, a man stripped of his grand delusions. His voice, once filled with the fire of a manufactured destiny, was now raw with the humility of true leadership. He did not offer excuses. He confessed to his blindness, to the pride that had nearly steered his kingdom onto the same ruinous path as drowned Númenor. With a single, decisive command, he ordered the dissolution of the Grand Armada. The ships that were to be his legacy would be broken down, their timbers repurposed for bridges and homes, a fleet of pride transformed into tools for peace. For the first time in a generation, he openly welcomed the Council of the Faithful, their ancient wisdom a balm to a kingdom poisoned by lies. In a private audience, the king turned to the two outlaws who had saved his throne and his soul. He offered them lands, titles, and chests of gold, a king's ransom for a king's life. Elaran and Caelen stood side by side, their faces etched not with triumph, but with a sober understanding. They refused it all. The shattering of the scepter had been a necessary act, but it was also a beacon. They had not merely broken a rod of obsidian, they had struck a direct blow against the will of Sauron himself. In doing so, they had stepped from the shadows of conspiracy directly into the gaze of the lidless eye. Mordor now knew their names, their faces, their methods. To accept a reward, to settle into a life of comfort within the very kingdom they had exposed, would be to build their own gilded cage, a target for the next, more careful wave of architects the Dark Lord would surely send. Their work was not over. It had only just begun, and its next chapter would have to be written in deeper shadows, far from the courts of kings. The king's gratitude was a cage neither of them could bear to enter. As the first mists of a fragile dawn rose over the city, the two companions stood at the edge of the rebuilt northern gate, the paths before them diverging as sharply as their natures. Caelen looked not east toward the comforts of the citadel, but north, into the wild, rolling hills where his duty had always truly lain. The rangers were broken, their command structure riddled with the lingering doubt and unseen loyalties Baranar had sown. To leave now would be to abandon the very heart of Arnor's defenses. His work was not one of grand revelations, but of quiet, patient rebuilding, a purge not with fire and sword, but with trust earned on long, cold patrols and shared hardship. He would remain to mend the ranks, to ensure that never again could a shadow wear the face of a friend. For Elaran, the path led west, to the gray havens and the shining shores of Lindon. Yet this was no triumphant return to the libraries of his people. He carried with him a burden heavier than any scroll, the full, unvarnished account of all they had uncovered. His journey home was a solemn one, for he was now the herald of a terrible new reality. He would stand before the High King Gil-galad himself and lay bare the evidence of the Shadow's most insidious warfare. This was not the blunt force of orc armies, but a patient, centuries-deep corruption that twisted truth and poisoned alliances from within. His testimony would be the first stone laid in a new foundation, a call for the free peoples to unite not just against marching legions, but against the whispers in the dark. Their farewell was not one of words, but of a shared, grim understanding. They clasped forearms, a grip that spoke of battles fought in trust, forged in fire, and then turned to walk their separate roads. One man to guard the body of a kingdom, the other to awaken its ancient soul. The conspiracy in Arnor was ended, but the War of the Architects had only just been declared. The Hidden War demanded a new kind of army, one that fought not with swords, but with memory. In the deep, silent places of the world, far from the courts of kings, Elaran gathered his first council. They were a strange fellowship of High Elf Loremasters, grim-faced Dúnedain rangers, and even a few dwarven lore keepers from the Blue Mountains, all bound by a shared understanding of the enemy's true nature. Their purpose was not to lead armies, but to read the subtle patterns of the world, to identify the whispers before they became roars. They established hidden refuges, not as fortresses, but as libraries of the enemy's methods, sanctuaries for truth in an age of growing shadows. Their greatest weapon was not a blade of steel, but a shared, vigilant memory, a network of watchers who understood that the fall of a kingdom begins not with a siege, but with a single, well-placed lie. This was the birth of a silent guardianship, a promise to never again be blind to the architects working in plain sight. Elaran knew, however, that memory alone was fragile. Men and elves could be slain, refuges could be discovered, and hard-won knowledge could be lost to time or treachery. He made a momentous decision, one that would define his legacy far more than any single act of heroism. He would turn their collective, painful wisdom into a permanent record. He gathered every scrap of evidence, the chronicle from the Barrow Downs, the ledgers from Tharbad, his own detailed accounts of the scepter's influence, and the first-hand testimonies of the rangers. With meticulous care, he began to write. He called this work the Book of Watchful Peace, It was not a dry history, but a living manual, a guide to recognizing the architecture of collapse. Its pages detailed the patterns of subversion, the methods used to turn ally against ally, the small, seemingly insignificant policy shifts that could starve a realm from within. It taught how to spot the symbols of hidden allegiance, like the serpent and the tower, and how to trace the flow of corrupted wealth and influence. This book was their ultimate act of defiance, transforming their desperate, reactive quest into a lasting, proactive shield for all free peoples. By committing their hard-won truths to parchment, they ensured that the knowledge of how kingdoms fall would never again be forgotten, that future generations would have the tools to guard against the slow, patient shadow that seeks not to conquer, but to corrupt. What other silent guardians might be walking among us today, their watchful eyes reading the patterns we barely notice? The chill of the northern wind carried a new kind of resolve. As a chieftain of the Rangers, Caelen no longer saw his duty as simply patrolling borders and hunting orcs. His command was now a school for a hidden war. He gathered his scouts not around maps of terrain, but around ledgers of behavior. He taught them to read the subtle patterns they had once been blind to spot the quiet corrosion that preceded an attack. A sudden, inexplicable price hike on southern grain, a local lord abruptly withdrawing his sons from a long-standing alliance, a perfectly timed rumor that sowed discord between villages. These, he explained, were the true weapons of their enemy. They practiced not just sword drills, but the art of listening, of tracing a whisper back to its source before it could become a shout. One evening, as the last light bled from the sky, Caelen led a small, trusted group deep into a sheltered grove, a place known only to them. From a carefully wrapped bundle, he produced a single sapling, its bark pale as moonlight, and its leaves a vibrant silver green. It was a scion of the white tree, a living memory of Númenor's lost grace. As he planted it in the rich, dark earth, the act was more than symbolic. This was not a tree for a king's court, to be admired by nobles. This was a root of vigilance, hidden in the wild, a silent testament to their new oath. They would guard the free peoples not just from the sword in the dark, but from the lie in the ear, a living vow to remember that the greatest battles are often fought not for land, but for the truth itself. In this quiet act, the Rangers transformed from sentinels of stone and steel into gardeners of hope, nurturing a fragile light against a shadow that never sleeps. Years later, the wind on the high moors of Eregion carried the same chill, but Elaran stood to meet it with a different heart. He was a sentinel now, not just of lands, but of truths. The pressure of the shadow was a constant, low hum at the edge of perception, a patient, probing weight against the borders of the free peoples. He no longer felt the frantic urgency of the fugitive, but the steady, sober clarity of the watchman. He had learned that darkness does not die. It only retreats and regroups, forever seeking new hands to build its designs and new voices to whisper its lies. Yet the light, too, had learned. It now had its own architects, its own keepers of memory. His life's purpose had crystallized into this quiet, unending commitment. He would be one of those keepers, a fixed point in the long, slow war against forgetting. His watch was not measured in days or seasons, but in the patient accumulation of dawns, each one a small victory against the night. In this silent, sprawling vigil, he found a profound peace, knowing that even the smallest light, held steady, could could define the shape of the surrounding dark. The king's own hand, the one that had signed the orders for the fleet, now closed around the shaft of a fallen banner. He did not lift it as a symbol of command, but as a shield, his face pale with the awful clarity of a man awakened from a long and terrible dream. He did not stand before Elaran and Caelen, but moved to stand beside them, his royal silks torn and stained, his eyes fixed on the spectral horror descending from the broken tower. The Nazgul, its form a vortex of shadow and cold fire, swept toward them, its presence a weapon that sought to unravel the very will to fight. It was a confrontation of absolutes, the architect of despair against the last desperate unity of those it had sought to divide. Elaran, the scholar who had once trusted only in scrolls, now stood with a king he had called blind. Caelen, the ranger whose faith had been shattered, now guarded the man who represented that broken trust. And the king, who had been the unwitting instrument of ruin, now raised a standard against it. They did not attack as one, but they stood as one, a threefold wall of defiance. The Ringwraith's power washed over them, a tide of ancient malice that promised futility and fear. It showed Elaran the ashes of libraries, Caelen the graves of his brothers, and the king the drowned ruins of his own capital. But the vision fractured against their shared resolve. The king did not flinch. He held the banner high, and in that simple, physical act, he reclaimed his own will. It was not a magical blow, but a human one, a declaration that the carefully sown lies would take no more root in his heart. The spectral form of the Nazgul recoiled, not from a sword or a spell, but from the sheer, unyielding force of a trust, reforged in the crucible of its own design. Its form flickered, its silent scream one of frustrated rage rather than triumphant malice. The shadow's hold, so meticulously built over generations, broke not because it was weak, but because the one thing it could not architect was this: a courage born not from pride, but from shared humility and a refusal to fall alone. The salt-tanged breeze of the gray havens carried the scent of endings and distant voyages. Elaran stood at the water's edge, the cries of gulls echoing his own unspoken farewell. Caelen remained a few paces back on the stone quay, his silhouette solid and grounded against the vast, shimmering sea. There were no grand speeches between them, for the fire of their shared journey had burned away the need for many words. The bond they had forged was no longer a flickering flame of desperate alliance, but a steady, settled beacon, a fixed star by which both would now navigate their separate paths. The great kingdoms were saved from immediate ruin, their foundations shored up against the collapse they had so narrowly averted. Yet the victory was a sober one, tasted not of sweet wine, but of clear, cold water. Both knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that the Shadow's architects were not destroyed, only delayed, that ancient malice would ever seek new weaknesses to exploit, new hearts to fill with pride, and new histories to erase. Their true legacy, then, was not the shattering of a single scepter, but the birth of an enduring vigilance. It became the quiet duty of those who remember how a kingdom's strength can be unraveled not by a sword, but by a sigh, how the brightest light can be slowly, patiently dimmed by whispered lies and the gentle, suffocating weight of forgotten history. In the end, their parting was not an end at all, but a widening of the watch, a promise that someone, somewhere, would always be reading the patterns in the